The room was thick with tension, the kind that made the air feel heavier, like the calm before a storm. Ethan sat in the corner, fiddling with a loose thread on his hoodie, completely unaware that he was minutes away from becoming the most infamous teenager in Maplewood Estates. His mom, Sarah, was flipping through a stack of HOA documents she'd printed out at 3 a.m., muttering under her breath about tyrants and power-hungry suburbanites. Outside the community center, the sun was setting over the pristine lawns and identical houses, casting long shadows that felt oddly foreboding. Then came the sound, sharp, piercing, and unmistakable. Bang! Karen's gavel hit the table, echoing through the room like a gunshot. Everyone jumped. Karen stood at the head of the table, her perfectly ironed blouse and pearl necklace gleaming under the fluorescent lights. She looked like she'd just stepped out of a catalog for Dictators of Suburbia Monthly. Her eyes scanned the room with laser precision before landing on Ethan, who froze mid-thread pick. "Ladies and gentlemen," Karen began, her voice dripping with theatrical gravitas. "We are gathered here today to address a matter of utmost importance, a matter that threatens the very fabric of our community." Ethan blinked. "What?" Sarah leaned over and whispered sharply, "Don't talk yet." Karen ignored them both and continued. "This is not just about one boy. This is about principles. This is about order. This is about respect for rules." She slammed her hand on a stack of papers as if they contained evidence of treason. By now, Ethan was starting to sweat. He glanced at his mom nervously. "What did I do?" he whispered. Sarah didn't answer. She was too busy glaring at Karen like she wanted to set her pearls on fire. Karen took a deep breath and pointed dramatically at Ethan, as if she were accusing him of masterminding a global conspiracy. "This young man," she declared, "was caught swimming in our community pool after hours." Gasps rippled through the room like waves in a kiddie pool. Bob, the HOA treasurer who looked like he'd just returned from vacationing in Margaritaville, shook his head solemnly. "Unbelievable," he muttered. Ethan stared at them in disbelief. "Are you serious?" It was 5 minutes past 8. Karen's eyes narrowed into slits. "Rules are rules," she hissed. "Rules are stupid." Ethan shot back before Sarah could stop him. The room erupted into murmurs, some shocked, some amused, and Karen's face turned an alarming shade of red. She grabbed her gavel again and banged it so hard that Bob flinched and spilled his coffee. "Enough!" Karen barked. "This behavior is exactly why we need consequences." Ethan leaned back in his chair and muttered under his breath. "Consequences for swimming? What's next? Life imprisonment for jaywalking." Karen's glare could have melted steel. She turned to Sarah with an expression that screamed, "Control your child." But Sarah wasn't backing down. She crossed her arms and said coolly, "What exactly are these consequences you're talking about?" Karen smiled. A slow, calculated smile that made everyone in the room uncomfortable. It was the kind of smile villains give right before they reveal their evil plan. "We've decided," Karen said slowly, savoring every word like it was fine wine, "that Ethan needs to learn accountability." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "And how do you propose he does that?" Karen's smile widened into something truly sinister. "Tomorrow morning," she said with relish, "we'll be taking Ethan out on a boat 15 miles offshore." The room went dead silent. "What?" Ethan said finally. Karen nodded as if this were perfectly reasonable. "He'll swim back to shore." Ethan laughed nervously. "Wait, you're joking, right?" Karen didn't flinch. "This is no joke." Sarah slammed her hands on the table so hard that Bob spilled his coffee again. "You can't be serious. That's not accountability. That's attempted murder." Karen waved her hand dismissively like Sarah had just accused her of jaywalking instead of plotting to strand a teenager in open water. "Oh, please," she said airily. "People swim marathons all the time. People train for marathons." Sarah shouted. Karen shrugged as if this were irrelevant. "He'll be supervised." "Supervised by whom?" Sarah demanded. Karen gestured toward Bob and another HOA member named Linda, an older woman whose only hobbies seemed to be knitting and glaring disapprovingly at people's front lawns. They both nodded solemnly like they'd been recruited for some noble cause instead of a wildly dangerous stunt. Sarah laughed bitterly and pointed at them both. "You two? You couldn't supervise a lemonade stand." Linda gasped indignantly while Bob muttered something about having lifeguard training. 30 years ago. Ethan looked between his mom and Karen nervously before asking cautiously, "So, am I actually doing this?" Sarah turned to him with fire in her eyes and said firmly, "Over my dead body." Then she grabbed Ethan by the arm and stormed out of the room. As they walked back to their car under the dim glow of streetlights, Ethan finally broke the silence. "So what now?" Sarah took a deep breath before replying with steel in her voice. "Now? Now we fight." Ethan woke up at dawn, groggy and disoriented, only to remember the nightmare awaiting him. Today was the day his HOA would fulfill their promise or threat to drop him 15 miles offshore. He stared at the ceiling, wondering if this was some elaborate prank. Surely, no one in their right mind would think this was a reasonable punishment for swimming 5 minutes past pool hours. Yet, here he was, about to be cast into the Atlantic like a modern-day Jonah, except there was no whale to save him. Just Karen and her HOA goons. By 7 a.m., Ethan and Sarah arrived at the marina. Sarah was fuming, her phone clutched tightly in her hand as she furiously typed emails to every lawyer she could think of. "This is insane," she muttered. "I've seen HOA overreach before, but this is criminal." Ethan wasn't sure what was worse, the prospect of swimming 15 miles or the fact that Karen had somehow convinced people this was a learning experience. Karen greeted them with her usual smugness, standing next to a small motorboat that looked like it hadn't been serviced since the Reagan administration. Bob was there too, wearing a captain's hat he'd clearly bought from Party City. Linda stood off to the side holding a clipboard, jotting down notes as if this were some kind of scientific experiment. "Good morning," Karen chirped, far too cheerful for someone about to abandon a teenager in open water. "Are we ready to begin?" Sarah stepped forward, her voice sharp enough to cut through steel. "Let me be clear. If anything happens to my son out there, I will personally see to it that every single one of you ends up in court." Karen waved her off like she was swatting away a fly. "Oh, relax, Mrs. Thompson. This is perfectly safe." "Safe?" Sarah snapped. "You're dropping him in the middle of the ocean. Have you even considered the risks? The currents? The wildlife? The possibility that he might drown?" Karen smiled condescendingly. "We've done our research." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Research? What research?" Karen gestured toward Bob, who cleared his throat and pulled out a laminated sheet of paper titled Open Water Safety Tips. It looked like something he'd printed off Google 10 minutes ago. "See," Bob said proudly. "We're prepared." Ethan glanced at the paper and read aloud, "Wear a fluorescent swim cap." "I don't even have one." Karen shrugged. "Well, that's not our fault." Sarah threw up her hands in exasperation. "This is beyond ridiculous." Ignoring her protests, Karen motioned for Ethan to board the boat. Reluctantly, he climbed aboard while Sarah followed close behind, still muttering threats under her breath. The boat sputtered to life barely, and they began their journey out to sea. About 30 minutes later, they reached what Karen deemed an appropriate distance from shore. Ethan stared at the endless expanse of water surrounding them and felt his stomach drop. This wasn't just far, it was too far. He couldn't even see land anymore. All he could see were waves and the occasional seagull. "All right," Karen announced brightly. "This is it." Ethan turned to her incredulously. "You're kidding, right?" Karen shook her head. "Nope. Time to swim." Sarah stepped forward, her face livid. "Absolutely not. This is dangerous and completely irresponsible." Karen ignored her and gestured toward Bob and Linda, who were already preparing to toss Ethan's backpack into the water like they were staging some bizarre survival reality show. "Ethan," Karen said sweetly, "this is your chance to prove you're mature enough to follow rules." Ethan stared at her for a moment before replying flatly, "You know what? I think I'll pass." Karen frowned. "That's not how this works." "Well," Sarah interjected firmly, "this isn't happening." She grabbed Ethan's arm and started pulling him toward the back of the boat. But before she could get far, Bob decided to intervene, or rather stumble forward awkwardly, and accidentally knocked over a cooler full of sandwiches into the water. "Oh, great!" Sarah muttered sarcastically. "Now we've got floating turkey clubs instead of common sense." Karen ignored her and turned back to Ethan with renewed determination. "Ethan," she said sternly, "you need to take responsibility for your actions." Ethan laughed bitterly. "Responsibility? You mean like how you're responsible for making sure residents don't get fined for having bird feeders?" Karen's face turned redder than Bob's Hawaiian shirt. "You know what?" Ethan continued with mock enthusiasm. "Maybe I should start my own HOA. We'll call it Swim Club Estates. And the only rule will be don't be insane." Bob chuckled nervously while Linda scribbled furiously on her clipboard, probably documenting Ethan's sarcasm as evidence against him. Eventually, after much arguing and several failed attempts by Karen to guilt-trip Ethan into jumping overboard, "Think of how proud your community will be." Sarah finally lost it. "That's it!" she shouted, grabbing Karen's clipboard and throwing it into the ocean. Karen gasped as if Sarah had just committed sacrilege. "You can take your ridiculous punishment," Sarah continued fiercely, "and shove it." Bob looked genuinely alarmed now, probably because he realized he might actually have to steer this rickety boat back to shore without getting sued. Linda sighed dramatically but said nothing. She seemed more interested in salvaging what remained of her notes than defending Karen's absurd plan. By the time they returned to shore, Ethan felt like he'd aged 10 years. Not from swimming but from sheer secondhand embarrassment at how far these people had gone just to prove a point about pool hours. As they stepped off the boat onto solid ground again, thankfully without any casualties, Sarah turned back one last time toward Karen and said coldly, "This isn't over." Sarah was on a mission. The moment they got home from the marina, she slammed her laptop open like she was about to hack into the Pentagon. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, still dripping seawater onto the floor, munching on a granola bar like nothing had happened. "Mom," he said between bites, "you're taking this way too seriously. They're just a bunch of bored suburbanites with clipboards." Sarah shot him a look that could have melted steel. "Bored suburbanites don't threaten to drop kids in the ocean for swimming after hours. This is war, Ethan." She typed furiously, searching for anything and everything about HOA laws in Florida. Within minutes, she was knee-deep in PDFs of the Florida Homeowners Association Act and articles titled, "How to Sue Your HOA Without Losing Your Mind." She muttered to herself as she read, "CC and Rs, governing documents, fines, liens. Oh, they've really stepped in it this time." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "What's a CCNR? Sounds like a rock band." "It stands for Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions," Sarah explained without looking up. "It's basically the HOA's Bible. Everything they do has to follow what's written in there. And if they don't..." She trailed off, her eyes lighting up with the kind of glee Ethan usually associated with villains in superhero movies. "What?" Ethan asked warily. Sarah grinned. "If they don't follow their own rules, we can sue them into oblivion." Ethan groaned. "Mom, I don't think suing Karen is going to make her less crazy." "Oh, it's not just Karen," Sarah said, scrolling through yet another legal document. "It's the whole board. And trust me, they've been breaking rules left and right." By the next morning, Sarah had compiled an entire dossier on Maplewood Estates HOA. She'd highlighted every questionable clause in their governing documents and bookmarked every relevant statute in Florida law. She even found a few juicy tidbits about past HOA scandals, like the time they fined a homeowner $500 for having a garden gnome that didn't align with community aesthetics. Armed with her newfound knowledge, Sarah decided it was time for backup. She called her friend Lisa, who worked as a paralegal and had once sued her own HOA over a parking dispute. "Lisa," Sarah said as soon as she answered, "how do I destroy an HOA?" Lisa laughed nervously. Is this a hypothetical question?" "Not even a little bit," Sarah replied. Lisa sighed. "All right, first things first. Have you read their CC and RS?" "Cover to cover," Sarah said proudly. "And have they violated anything in there?" "Oh, where do I start?" Sarah said with a laugh that was equal parts amused and unhinged. They've been fining people without proper notice, enforcing rules that aren't even in the CC and RS. And now they're trying to drown my kid as some kind of twisted punishment. Lisa paused. Okay, yeah, that last one's definitely illegal. Over the next few days, Sarah went full detective mode. She interviewed neighbors who'd had run-ins with the HOA, collected copies of every fine notice they'd ever sent out, and even found an old resident who'd moved away after being fined $1,000 for having an unapproved mailbox color. One particularly enlightening conversation was with Mr. Jenkins, an elderly man who lived 2 doors down and had been battling the HOA for years over his rose bushes. They said I couldn't have more than 3 bushes, Jenkins grumbled as he sipped his tea. 3. Who limits roses? It's un-American. Sarah nodded sympathetically while jotting down notes. And did they ever explain why? They said it was in the CC and RS, Jenkins said bitterly. But when I asked them to show me where it said that, Karen just waved her clipboard at me like it was some kind of holy relic. Sarah smirked. Typical Karen. Meanwhile, Ethan was starting to realize just how deep his mom's grudge against the HOA went. One afternoon, he found her sitting at the dining table surrounded by stacks of papers and legal books. Mom, he said cautiously, you've been at this for days. Maybe you should take a break. Sarah looked up at him with wild eyes. A break? Ethan, these people tried to kill you. They didn't try to kill me, Ethan replied weakly. They might as well have. Sarah snapped before turning back to her laptop. No one messes with my family and gets away with it. Ethan sighed and grabbed a bag of chips from the pantry. He wasn't sure what scared him more, Karen's gavel or his mom on a legal rampage. The real breakthrough came when Sarah stumbled upon an obscure clause buried deep in the CC and RS about non-monetary penalties. Gotcha, she muttered triumphantly. What now? Ethan asked from across the room. Sarah spun her laptop around to show him the screen. This clause says that any non-monetary penalty has to be approved by at least 75% of homeowners. Ethan squinted at the screen. So, Sarah said with a grin. There's no way Karen got 75% of homeowners to approve throwing you into the ocean. Ethan frowned. Wait, does that mean? It means their punishment wasn't just insane. It was illegal, Sarah interrupted gleefully. Armed with this new information, Sarah wasted no time drafting an official complaint against the HOA. She cited every violation she could find. Improper enforcement of rules, failure to follow due process, and of course, endangering her son's life. She sent copies of the complaint to every member of the HOA board along with a strongly worded letter demanding their immediate resignation. Karen responded within hours, because of course she did, with an email full of legal jargon and thinly veiled threats about countersuing for defamation. Sarah read it aloud to Ethan while laughing so hard she nearly spilled her coffee. She really thinks she can scare me? Sarah said between giggles. Oh honey, I've dealt with worse bullies than you. As word spread about Sarah's crusade against the HOA, other residents began coming forward with their own horror stories. Fines for leaving trash cans out too long. Threats over unapproved holiday decorations. Even one woman who'd been forced to repaint her front door because it wasn't on Karen's approved colors list. It quickly became clear that Karen and her cronies had been running Maplewood Estates like their own personal fiefdom, and no one had dared stand up to them until now. But thanks to Sarah's determination and borderline obsessive research, people were finally starting to fight back. And while Ethan wasn't exactly thrilled about being at the center of all this drama, he couldn't help but feel a little proud of his mom for taking on Karen and winning. The HOA meeting was packed. Word had spread like wildfire through Maplewood Estates, and now the community center was standing room only. Sarah sat near the front, her arms crossed and her face set in a look of determination that could have scared off a grizzly bear. Ethan sat next to her, trying to look inconspicuous, though it was hard to blend in when half the room was whispering things like, "That's the kid they tried to drown," and "I heard Karen's going to lose it tonight." Karen, of course, was at the head of the table, flanked by her loyal minions, Bob and Linda. She looked calm, too calm, The kind of calm that made you wonder if she'd spent the afternoon practicing her rebuttal in front of a mirror while sipping chamomile tea out of a mug that said HOA Queen. Bob was nervously shuffling papers, and Linda was furiously scribbling notes as if she were preparing for a congressional hearing. "Let's get started," Karen said, banging her gavel with unnecessary force. "We're here to address some concerns that have been raised about the board's recent actions." Sarah raised her hand immediately, but Karen ignored her. First, Karen continued, "I'd like to remind everyone that the HOA operates under a strict set of rules and guidelines designed to maintain the integrity of our community." Sarah snorted loudly. "Integrity? Is that what we're calling it now?" Karen's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. Instead, she gestured toward Bob, who cleared his throat and began reading from a prepared statement. "We believe that our actions were justified," Bob said in his best attempt at an authoritative voice. "The punishment assigned to Ethan was intended to teach responsibility and respect for community rules." Sarah shot out of her chair so fast it nearly tipped over. "Responsibility?" she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "You tried to throw my son into the ocean. That's not responsibility. That's lunacy." The room erupted into murmurs, and Karen banged her gavel again. "Order. We will have order." But Sarah wasn't done. She pulled out a stack of papers and waved them in the air like she was holding the winning ticket at a bingo hall. "These are your CC and RS," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "And guess what? Nowhere in here does it say you can impose non-monetary penalties without homeowner approval. So not only was your little punishment insane, it was illegal." Karen's face turned an alarming shade of red, but before she could respond, another resident stood up. A man named Greg who lived 2 streets over and had been fined 3 times for having an unapproved mailbox. "She's right," Greg shouted. "They've been making up rules for years. Last month they told me I couldn't park my truck in my own driveway because it didn't match the aesthetic of the neighborhood." Another woman stood up, Mrs. Patel, who'd once been fined for planting sunflowers in her front yard. "They fined me $200 for flowers," she said indignantly. "Flowers? Who hates sunflowers?" The murmurs grew louder as more residents began sharing their own horror stories. Fines for leaving Christmas lights up too long, threats over unapproved patio furniture. Even one man who'd been told his dog wasn't on the HOA-approved breed list. Karen banged her gavel again, but this time it didn't have its usual effect. People were angry, angrier than Karen had anticipated, and no amount of gavel banging was going to quiet them down. "Enough!" Karen shouted finally. "These accusations are baseless. The HOA has always acted in the best interests of this community." Sarah laughed, a sharp, humorless laugh that cut through the noise like a knife. "Best interests? You mean your interests?" She turned to face the crowd. "Did you know Karen gets free landscaping services paid for by HOA funds? Or that Bob's nephew is the one who prints all those ridiculous fine notices for twice the market rate?" The room went dead silent. Karen's eyes widened in panic. "That is completely irrelevant." "Oh, I think it's very relevant," Sarah shot back. "Because while you've been busy policing mailbox colors and pool hours, you've also been lining your own pockets." The murmurs started again, this time angrier than before, and Karen looked like she might actually explode. But Sarah wasn't done yet. She reached into her bag and pulled out one final piece of evidence. An email chain between Karen and Bob discussing how they could justify raising HOA fees without holding a vote. "This," Sarah said triumphantly, holding up the printed emails for everyone to see, "is proof that this board has been violating its own rules for years." Greg stood up again. "I say we vote them out." The room erupted into cheers and applause as more residents stood up to voice their support. Karen banged her gavel one last time, hard enough to crack the handle. But it was no use. The tide had turned, and there was no stopping it now. By the end of the night, Karen and her cronies had been voted out by an overwhelming majority. A new board was elected on the spot, one made up of residents who actually cared about things like fairness and common sense. As people filed out of the community center, Sarah leaned over to Ethan with a satisfied smile on her face. "See? she said. Told you we'd win. Ethan rolled his eyes but couldn't help smiling back. Yeah, you're a hero or whatever. Sarah laughed and ruffled his hair affectionately. Damn right I am. The fallout from the HOA coup was nothing short of spectacular. By the next morning, the entire neighborhood was buzzing with the kind of energy usually reserved for Black Friday sales or celebrity sightings at the local Target. Karen's reign of terror was officially over, and the residents of Maplewood Estates were basking in their newfound freedom. It was like the Berlin Wall had come down, but instead of bricks and mortar, it was clipboards and passive-aggressive emails. Sarah, of course, was the hero of the hour. Everywhere she went, people stopped her to say thank you or share their own stories of HOA-induced misery. Mrs. Patel brought over a tray of samosas as a token of appreciation, and Greg offered to mow her lawn for free for the rest of the summer. Even Mr. Jenkins, who rarely left his house unless it was to argue about his rose bushes, showed up with a bottle of wine and a heartfelt, "You did good, kid." Ethan, meanwhile, was enjoying his own 15 minutes of fame. At school, he became known as the kid who took down the HOA, which was way cooler than being the kid who almost drowned because Karen's insane. His friends couldn't get enough of the story. "Dude," one of them said during lunch, "you're like a legend now. You should totally write a book or something." "Yeah," Ethan replied with a smirk. "I'll call it How to Survive Suburbia, a teenager's guide to fighting tyranny." But while most people were celebrating, Karen was plotting her comeback. She'd retreated to her house like a disgraced monarch in exile, but everyone knew she wasn't going down without a fight. Rumor had it she'd already contacted a lawyer to discuss her options, which probably included suing half the neighborhood for defamation. Sarah wasn't worried. She'd spent weeks preparing for this moment, and she had enough evidence to bury Karen in so much paperwork that even Bob's nephew wouldn't be able to print it all out. Still, she couldn't resist one last act of petty revenge. One afternoon, Sarah and Ethan were walking past Karen's house when they noticed her meticulously arranging her garden gnomes on the front lawn. Sarah grinned and pulled out her phone. "What are you doing?" Ethan asked. "Taking pictures," Sarah replied innocently. "Why?" "Because," Sarah said with a mischievous glint in her eye, "those gnomes are definitely not on the approved list." Ethan laughed so hard he nearly fell over. "Mom, you're evil." "I learned from the best," Sarah said with a wink. Meanwhile, the new HOA board wasted no time making changes. Their first order of business? Repealing every ridiculous rule Karen had ever implemented. Sunflowers? Allowed. Mailbox colors? Pick whatever shade you want. Pool hours? Open until midnight. Bring your unicorn floaties if you've got them. They also decided to host a community party to celebrate their newfound freedom. It was held at the community pool, naturally, and featured everything Karen would have hated. Loud music, inflatable water slides, and enough barbecue smoke to set off 3 fire alarms. Ethan was the guest of honor, or at least that's what everyone kept telling him as they handed him plates of ribs and cans of soda. At one point, Greg grabbed a microphone and made an impromptu speech. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, raising his beer can in salute. "Let's hear it for Ethan Thompson, the only kid brave enough to stand up to Karen and live to tell the tale." The crowd erupted into cheers and applause as Ethan awkwardly waved from his pool chair. Sarah leaned over and whispered, "Enjoy it while it lasts. Tomorrow you're mowing the lawn." But perhaps the most satisfying part of the whole ordeal came a few weeks later when Sarah received an official letter from Karen's lawyer. A cease and desist order accusing her of slander and demanding an apology. Sarah read it aloud to Ethan while sipping her morning coffee. When she finished, she set it down on the table and said calmly, "Well, this is adorable. What are you gonna do?" Ethan asked. "Oh," Sarah said with a sly smile, "I'm going to frame it." And she did, right next to her collection of HOA violation notices. As life in Maplewood Estates returned to normal, or as normal as life could be in a neighborhood where people once debated mailbox regulations like they were constitutional amendments, Sarah couldn't help but feel proud of what they'd accomplished. They'd stood up to bullies in blazers and won, not just for themselves but for everyone who'd ever been fined for having an unapproved garden gnome. Ethan still rolled his eyes whenever she brought it up. "Mom, stop acting like you took down the mafia. But deep down he knew she was right. They'd made their community better, one sarcastic email at a time. And as for Karen, well, let's just say she wasn't invited to any more pool parties. So there you have it, proof that even in suburbia, where drama usually involves whose dog pooped on whose lawn, you can fight back against injustice and win. Sure, it might take some late-night legal research and more than a few passive-aggressive comments at HOA meetings, but hey, victory tastes even sweeter when it's served with barbecue ribs by your neighbors. If you enjoyed this story, and let's be honest, who doesn't love watching petty tyrants get what they deserve? Don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, especially if they've ever had their own HOA horror stories, and leave a comment below about your favorite part. And if you haven't already subscribed, well, what are you waiting for? Hit that button so you don't miss our next tale of suburban chaos. Thanks for watching, and remember, never underestimate a mom on a mission.